And now we seem to be ready for our third talk in this session, and this one by Diana Mazzarella. And yes, Diana is with us. Great.
Yes, I'm here.
Another talk on irony and Nausicaa Pouscoulous. So the floor is yours, and another paper on irony, the title of which you can now see on the screen. Great.
Thank you. Today's presentation will aim at answering the question of what makes irony understanding possible. And we are going to first focus on one of the key features of irony, the fact that it involves expressing a specific dissociative attitude. And then we will move to the question of what are the cognitive capacities that make the recognition and understanding of this attitude possible. We will suggest that there is a role to be played by our cognitive capacity for epistemic vigilance, and we will propose a distinction between first and second order epistemic vigilance and discuss the way in which these different orders of vigilance contribute to irony understanding. So let's start with the ironical attitude. Most theoretical approaches to irony recognize that attitude expression is a key feature of verbal irony. And this intuition goes back to Grice, who once wrote that irony is intimately connected with the expression of a feeling, attitude, or evaluation. I cannot say something ironically unless what I say is intended to reflect how style or derogatory judgment or a feeling such as indignation or contempt. And this intuition was later developed in a full-fledged account by relevance theory, and its echoic account of irony. And for the purpose of this talk, what we are interested in is stressing the fact that according to this account, irony has a triadic nature. So it involves not only an ironical speaker and an addressee, but also an ironical source. So more specifically, the ironical speaker communicates a dissociative attitude to the addressee, but what this dissociative attitude is about is a thought that is attributed to an ironical source that is different from the speaker herself at the present time, and that is echoed by the ironical utterance. So when we look at the attitude that is expressed by irony, we can say that this attitude is expressed implicitly, and that is always dissociative. And this is regardless of the interactional function of the ironical statement. So independently of whether the irony is used to make a compliment or to criticize, the irony always involves a dissociative attitude. And this dissociative attitude, as Deidre pointed out, can vary quite widely, falling anywhere on a spectrum from amused tolerance through various shades of resignation or disappointment to contempt, disgust, outrage, or scorn. Now, when we look at the experimental literature, there is evidence, empirical evidence, supporting the idea that attitude recognition plays a crucial role in irony understanding. A first set of relevant studies concerns those studies that look at the role of social information, such as speaker traits, the fact that the speaker is, for instance, described as being frank or being a jokester, or information that are inferred from social categories like the speaker occupation, and look at these information as cue to communicative intent. And what they found was that when this social information and the cultural, sociocultural stereotypes that were evoked aligned with the expression of a dissociative attitude in a given context, for instance, the fact that the speaker was a comedian, this could facilitate irony understanding. There is also a second set of study that looks at the role, at the presence of an antecedent of the ironical utterance. And these studies show that when the proposition that is expressed, that is literally expressed by the irony, is present. So in the previous linguistic context, where there is an antecedent for the ironical statement, for the proposition that is echoed by the irony, then processing is facilitated. And this could be arguably discussed in terms of the salience of the proposition that the attitude, the dissociative attitude, is dissociating from, and so the facilitating role for irony recognition. Now, the question that we want to ask today is the question of which sociocognitive skills are involved in attributing this implicitly dissociative attitude. And the suggestion that we want to make is that there is an important role that is played by our cognitive capacity for epistemic vigilance. So when we talk about epistemic vigilance, we refer to a suite of cognitive mechanisms that are targeted at the risk of misinformation, either accidental or intentional. And we typically distinguish between two different types of vigilance mechanisms. What we call epistemic vigilance towards the source, so those mechanisms that assess the trustworthiness of the individuals who dispense the information, for instance, their competence and honesty, but also epistemic vigilance towards the content that refers to those mechanisms that assess the quality and believability of the incoming information. So what is the role of epistemic vigilance in irony understanding? First of all, we can focus on epistemic vigilance towards the source. And we can start by the assumption that when the ironical speaker expresses a proposition that is false or irrelevant, she does not believe it to be true. And this is what distinguishes, for instance, irony from mistakes. And crucially, she does not intend to convince the hearer that this is true. And this is what distinguishes irony from lies. So it seems that irony might require to actively evaluate the competence of the speaker in order to rule out the possibility that they are mistaken, and the honesty of the speaker to rule out the possibility that they are trying to deceive the addressee. And at least this suggestion seems to find some kind of support when we look at the developmental literature and the findings suggesting that young children misunderstand irony as an error or as a lie around the age, until the age of 5, 6, when their epistemic vigilance towards deception starts to be properly in place. And it's only after this point that they typically get to recognize the ironical intent of the speaker. So let's move now to epistemic vigilance towards the content. Once again, we can start with the assumption that the ironical speaker expresses something that is blatantly false or irrelevant to communicate a dissociative attitude. And so the suggestion here is that epistemic vigilance that assess the falsehood or irrelevance of a proposition could actually help detect the presence of such a contextual incongruency that can be a cue, a strong cue for irony. And there is also experimental evidence suggesting that when the magnitude of this contextual incongruency is manipulated, the stronger the contextual incongruency, the easier is the irony to process. But, and this is an important point, epistemic vigilance towards the content does not seem to be sufficient or necessary for irony understanding. And the reason is that even in cases in which there is no perceived contextual incongruency, irony can be understood. Irony can, for instance, be recognized in situations when the hearer has no prior beliefs about the context, and so cannot perceive such a contextual incongruency, or in cases in which the speaker and the hearer disagree with respect to their evaluation of the proposition at issue. And so the hearer does not share the dissociative attitude that is expressed by the speaker. In all these cases, although there's no contextual incongruency perceived, irony can still be recognized and understood. So these lead us to suggest that while these epistemic vigilance mechanisms might be helpful to recognize the ironical intent, they are fundamentally insufficient. And given that irony crucially understands the recognition of this attitude that is expressed by the speaker, and that this attitude may but need not be shared by the addressee, to recognize it, we need something more. And our suggestion is that we need more sophisticated forms of epistemic vigilance, what we refer to as second-order epistemic vigilance, to distinguish it from first-order epistemic vigilance mechanisms like the one that we have discussed so far. So, what is a second-order epistemic vigilance? We define it as the ability to assess other people's epistemic vigilance towards the source and towards the content of a piece of information. So to clarify this concept, let me provide you with an example. Imagine that your friend, Deirdre, is a fervent reader of a tabloid that is renowned for its sensationalist style and poor fact-checking. And suppose that in many conversations that you have with her, she reports sensationalist stories failing to perceive their blatant falsehood, thus failing to exercise first-order epistemic vigilance towards the content. And suppose that when you pressed her on these, she insists on the accuracy of these stories by attributing them to the tabloid at issue. So failing to exercise epistemic vigilance towards the source. Now, your second-order epistemic vigilance will lead you to question Deirdre's vigilance towards misinformation. And so you will probably be less likely to trust Deirdre, at least when it comes to your discussions on current issues that are at the forefront on the news. So when it comes to second-order vigilance, what is the target of this form of vigilance is the speaker first-order epistemic vigilance. So let's see how this is useful for irony understanding. And in line with the example that I just sketched, what is interesting to consider here is the first-order vigilance of the ironical speaker, as well as the second-order vigilance of the hearer. So let's start with the speaker's perspective. An ironical speaker needs to first entertain a dissociative attitude that is underpinned by some kind of vigilance, epistemic vigilance towards the content and towards the source. So there cannot be any dissociation if there is any vigilance. But crucially, and this is a point that Deirdre Wilson already made in 2009, by communicating this attitude, the speaker makes epistemic vigilance manifest. So in being ironical, we could say the speaker makes manifest that she entertains a thought that is attributed to a different source, the ironical source, and critically evaluates it. If we take now the perspective of the hearer, then we can say that understanding the ironical intent of the speaker involves grasping this dissociative attitude. And for this, the hearer must be able to exercise a more advanced second-order vigilance and attribute epistemic vigilance towards the source and the content to the ironical speaker and evaluate it. So it's only by doing this that the hearer can recognize that the speaker is expressing a dissociative attitude by distancing herself from a content that she takes to be false or irrelevant, and a content that she attributes to a source that is arguably unreliable. So it is by assessing whether a speaker has gone through this epistemic evaluation and whether the speaker has taken the output of this epistemic evaluation as a reason to express this dissociative stance, that the hearer can interpret the speaker's utterance as being ironical. So, to conclude, we want to suggest that irony requires a richer cognitive repertoire than other non-literal uses of language like metaphor, hyperbole, metonymy, and crucially, that among the socio-cognitive skills that are involved in irony understanding, there is a role played by epistemic vigilance, first and second order vigilance. So when it comes to first order epistemic vigilance, these would be needed to differentiate irony from errors or lies. And crucially, we can think of it in terms of those mechanisms that allow the hearer to assess the trustworthiness of the ironical speaker, her competence and benevolence, rule out the possibility that she's mistaken or that she's lying, but also epistemic vigilance towards the content that assess the believability of the thought that is echoed and potentially detects some contextual incongruency. But crucially, the point that we want to make is that there is something else that is needed, and this is second order epistemic vigilance. And this is what allows to grasp the dissociative attitude that is carried by irony. And once again, we can think of second order epistemic vigilance directed to the source. And this would concern the assessment of the ironical speaker's vigilance towards the trustworthiness of the ironical source, or to the content, with the assessment of the ironical speaker's vigilance towards the believability of the thought that is echoed. So irony requires to successfully integrate the output of multiple mechanisms of first and second order epistemic vigilance towards the source and towards the content. And this requirement is what can arguably add some extra complexity and lead to some comprehension and processing difficulties that are evidenced in the experimental literature on processing, as well as to the later developmental trajectory that we observed when we look at when children start understanding irony. So thank you very much, and we're happy to answer any question.
Thank you very much. And we've got, I'm sure that there are going to be a number of questions. This was a really illuminating and very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Since for some reason, I now cannot see anybody, can please people who would like to ask questions simply turn on the mics and speak.
May I?
Go ahead, Agnieszka.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to share with you my sort of instinct that I feel very much that you are right. I'm just wondering if you are going to follow this research by some experimental study because, well, it will be very, very promising, because if you mention those developmental trajectory, so surely, well, it can be grasped experimentally that there is a stage that the first level vigilance has been mastered and the second order not necessarily so. I also have this intuition, sorry if this sounds a bit naive, but like there's clearly a difference between somebody not getting irony completely, that is mistaking an ironist for yeah, you know, somebody who is wrong or who is a liar, and somebody who recognizes irony, but it cannot sort of enjoy the benefits of ironic communication, or not really grasping the full intention behind ironic communication. So I think this somehow, you know, corroborates this distinction, this observation. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot for the question. Actually, we are running some studies at the moment in collaboration with Maria Gir and Anna Milosavljevic that are part of our team. So we are working in two different directions. On the one hand, we are running some studies in order to develop paradigms to test the development of these second-order vigilance. So far, the literature has been concerned to what we have called first-order vigilance mechanisms. And so the first effort independently of the study of irony is actually to try to map the developmental trajectory of these more sophisticated forms of epistemic vigilance. And then we are running a second set of studies that concern the role of epistemic vigilance in irony understanding. So one of the ways in which we have approached these issues so far, and the data collection is actually ongoing, is by creating a paradigm in which children are presented with a series of stories in which they are confronted with some irony in certain condition. But crucially, what we do is manipulating the reliability of the ironical source. So the expectation would be that if epistemic vigilance does play a role, then this reliability manipulation should have an impact in the direction of making irony more easily recognized when the ironical source is perceived by the kid as unreliable. So these are the two directions that we have been taking in the last year, and so hopefully we will be able to share some results in the next conferences. Thanks.
The floor is open to questions and comments. Ingrid?
Can I ask a question, Diana?
Yes.
Sure. So this experiment that you just mentioned, what's the age range that you're looking at there?
So the epistemic vigilance, the second order epistemic vigilance, we have tested so far. We have been collecting actually data from first age, which is 4 to 5, to 3H, that is 6 to 7.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is the range, and when it comes to irony, so we have started by looking as a target group at the 6-year-old, because of course, based also on your results, we expected that to be more or less a triggering point. So we have now collected data for the 6-year-old, and we are going to be expanding our data collection with the other age groups, going probably lower and up.
Okay, that's right. I would be really interested in hearing what the results, come out. We did an experiment. It hasn't been published yet, but where we also manipulated the reliability of the source. of the ironical statement, where we tested 3 to 7-year-olds, and we didn't find any effect of that actually in that young age group. But maybe you'll find something if you have a different kind of design as well. So that would be interesting to hear. I was also wondering a bit what you think of cases such as mimicry and parody and other cases of humor, where it seems that children have to recognize some sort of dissociative attitude. And this is something they typically acquire much earlier than irony. Whether you have any thoughts on those cases?
So I'm wondering whether the kind of dissociation that is involved in the two cases is actually the same kind of dissociation, which doesn't seem to be the case. So and this indeed goes a bit in the direction of studies that look at pretense and the ability that children have to master pretense much earlier actually than when they do master irony. So I would say that also looking at these kind of data, it seems that although we could describe them in some sense as dissociative, there must be something very different going on in the two cases. So I don't know the extent to which we can really think of them as being unified by the presence of a dissociative attitude. So also because in cases in cases of pretense, for instance, this dissociative attitude doesn't seem to be part of what is actually communicated, but kind of sets the background on the way, the background with respect to which we need to interpret all the rest of the communication that is going on. So it's actually an interesting point, and we haven't really explored much this distinction, but I think it would be worth to really spell it out more carefully in terms of the distinct types of dissociations that might be involved. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ingrid, I feel that in addition to this distinction between maybe two different types of dissociation, the kind of cues they have in mimicry, in particular for younger kids, are extraordinarily strong. And are much closer. I mean, they seem to be related to very, very early games that are played even with infants about, again, pretending to eat their feet or whatever, and I think that they're connected to those, and the cues are huge, and they're clearly not only linguistic. So I'm wondering also whether sometimes the child first and foremost grasps the cue, that very strong physical cue that connects to a whole lot of reiterated experiences from a very early age, and only then gets to the fact that there is a dissociation in those cases of but certainly I think I remember Livia Cole, a researcher, she was working on irony understanding in children too, and she just couldn't get how they couldn't understand it, because they could do all these other things so early, and it's true. Thank you. Yes, do we have any other comment or question? There is probably time for one more short one. I cannot see anybody who would like to say anything. So I would like to thank very warmly our speakers in this session, and all those who have joined this session. Thank you very much.